I'm very, very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker. With our speakers, the bios are in the program, and so I'm not going to spend too much time. But I just want to say about John Carlin, this is the person in our government up until last October who was, in terms of the law, the focal point of all national security investigations and certainly things with respect to cyberspace. He did go to Harvard. We're trying to overlook that. But he is, what's different about John is that the guy's like super smart and has a lot of responsibility, but he's a truly nice guy. You would not be upset being stuck in an airport with John, which is always my test of whether, you know, somebody's really, you know, the kind of person you want to associate with. He's very generous with his time. He's come down here. He's now with Morrison Foerster, and his practice, the focus of his practice, he sort of does risk management and crisis management. Let me tell you, for my money, the #1 person on planet Earth for crisis management would have to be John Carlin. And if I was in a crisis and I could afford him, which probably would not be the case, I would look to him for assistance. Without further ado, John, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for that introduction, and I hope we are never stuck in an airport together. But if we were, it would be great to have you there. I thought I'd start today. I just want to set the frame, and let me use is a real case. So imagine this: you're at a company inside the United States, and you're a trusted retail brand name. People know you all over the country, all over the world. They trust your products, and you're in the C-suite. In other words, you're the chief executive officer or the general counsel. You have responsibility for the company. Someone comes in from your information technology staff and they say, hey boss, we've been hacked. It looks like a relatively unsophisticated hacker. Someone got inside our system, but I'm telling you, a 12-year-old could do this. It's commercially available products. I know that means we need to do some better things on our system, but I got this. They then tell you that the hacker stole a relatively small amount of personally identifiable information, names, addresses. Something that happens every day to hundreds of thousands of companies across the world. Small amount, unsophisticated hack. We got them off the system. The vast majority of companies today hear that and they go back to business. A couple weeks later, guy comes knocking on the door again. Boss, we heard from the hacker, and the hacker sent us a note through Gmail and said, we want you to pay us $500 through Bitcoin, and if you give me $500, I won't embarrass you by releasing the fact that I took these names and addresses. But we got them. Again, the vast majority of companies around the world would either pay the $500, and they're doing this day in and day out, and make the nuisance go away, or they would choose not to pay, thinking the guy was full of hot air and this just isn't that sophisticated and we're going to go back to business. This is a real case. And if that company had done what so many others are doing, what they wouldn't have found out was that on the other end of that hack was not the low-level crook that it seemed. It was an extremist from Kosovo, and the extremist had moved from Kosovo to Malaysia. From Malaysia, he was online with some other co-conspirators. Together, they hacked into this company. And on the back end, what he was doing with this information wasn't just making a buck, although they did want that $500. But instead, he had formed a friendship through Twitter with one of the most notorious terrorists in the world, a British-born citizen named Junaid Hussain, who had moved from London to Raqqa, Syria, where he was now located in the heart of the Islamic State of the Levant. He was one of the key figures in what had been a substantial change in strategy for terrorists. He was one of the key figures for the Islamic State of the Levant in adopting a strategy of crowdsourcing terrorism. And by that, I mean, just like Al-Qaeda had taken advantage of Western technology that's used for good to turn it against us with aviation. He was taking advantage of what we were providing for free through Western ingenuity, American ingenuity, which is the ability to communicate en masse, instantaneously with millions of people across the world. And they were using social media in order to recruit and inspire individuals to commit terrorist acts, that's crowdsourcing of terrorism, and also to communicate directly in real time to plot. So this British citizen now living in Raqqa, Syria, gets in touch with this Kosovo extremist now living in Malaysia about the information that they stole from the United States. And what he does with that list of stolen personally identifiable information, names and addresses, was cull through it to see who looks like they're in the government or the military. And they would look to see if it's a .gov or a .mil or other indicia that these might be people who are government employees. They created that kill list, and then using Twitter, blasted it back out to their adherents inside the United States from Raqqa, Syria, and said, kill these people by name, by address, where they live. That is the current face of the terrorist threat. Because that company did work together with government, we were able to take action. And so that individual who did this, his name is Farizi. And he was arrested pursuant because of good cooperation through the State Department with Malaysia. Their law enforcement authorities arrested him pursuant to United States process. He was extradited to the United States. He pled guilty this summer and was sentenced to 20 years of incarceration. Junaid Hussain, who is in ungoverned space in Raqqa, Syria, was killed in a publicly acknowledged military strike by Central Command. Not easy, though. The current face of the terrorist threat is one that crosses countries. What is that, 5 different countries that are involved there, and that moves at the speed of digital communications. And in order to combat this threat, we need to change some of our structures and thinking to do it effectively. Let me back up a little bit. The division that, when I left the Department of Justice, the division I headed was the National Security Division. It was the first new litigating division at the Department of Justice in about 50 years. And we were created as a post-9/11 reform. And the idea was simple, that prior to September 11th, we had failed to adequately share information across the law enforcement and intelligence divide and between the United States and our allied countries overseas. And that we had to take down the so-called wall of legal, regulatory, and cultural reasons why information wasn't shared across that divide. And make no mistake, there were reasons why that wall was up, and there were some, to protect civil rights, civil liberties, and to keep lanes clear. But the decision was the cost was too great. We needed to take the wall down, share that information effectively so that we could act quickly and prevent another September 11th from occurring. So the National Security Division, in addition to the legal changes, was created in 2006 with that idea in mind, that the lawyers who prosecute criminal cases in the Article 3 criminal justice system, the lawyers that appear before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to help the intelligence agencies gain access to communications, whether it's NSA, FBI, or CIA, and do oversight of that community, the policy lawyers that represent the Department and the National Security Council to set the rules and parameters for things like ranging from military strikes to regulatory issues, and the lawyers that review transactions for national security risk would all sit side by side. There'd be one assistant attorney general for national security. There'd be a one-stop shop. Prior to that, they had reported through 4 different chains at the Department of Justice and been kept secret. So that's why the division was formed. And when it came to combating the Al-Qaeda version of the terrorist threat, I think we made enormous strides. So when I say the Al-Qaeda version, that again is the version where what they're trying to do was on a scale of September 11th or greater, and it required long-term plotting and planning and bringing operatives physically from the United States or elsewhere into Afghanistan or Pakistan, training them and then deploying them back out. So it had a long lead time. They tended to be larger, complex plots. And day in, day out, we got used to a system where the lawyers from National Security Division, we would sit with our counterparts. I would sit in the Deputies Committee meeting in the Situation Room in the National Security Council if there was a terrorist issue. You'd get the facts and circumstances surrounding it. We'd go around the table and each look to our respective legal authorities and competences and say, here's what we could bring to the table to disrupt it. We might have a criminal case. Treasury might be able to sanction that terrorist group to prevent them from getting finances. State Department might work with the foreign government. The military might look on a capture or kill operation, or to help build up the capacity of another country to confront their terrorist threat. So we were pretty mature at that type of discussion when it came to the terrorist threat. This crowdsourcing of terrorism, though, put a lot of pressure on us. And we, when it comes to combating the terrorist threat, our division was formed with a mantra in mind that success could no longer be measured by the successful prosecution of a criminal case after the terrorist attack has occurred, when families are grieving and have lost loved ones. Success had to be measured by the ability to prevent that attack from occurring in the first instance. And that meant, as lawyers, looking across all the available legal tools to see which lever or tool you could use or use in combination to best thwart the terrorist group from what they wanted to do. As we saw this move towards crowdsourcing of terrorism, we saw a spike in activity inside the United States. So in the last 2 years, we brought more cases related to international terrorists than we'd ever brought before in our history. And when you look at what was happening with those cases inside the United States, unlike some of our closest allies, we didn't have a threat on the same scale. So to give you an example, for a large point in time, I don't have the most current statistic, but if you looked at the number of foreign terrorist fighters, those who attempted to go abroad to fight in the Levant, in the Syria-Iraq region, in the United States, it was in the low hundreds. If we had had a comparable problem to, say, Belgium, it would be 30,000 individuals in the US. So as tough as we had it, it wasn't as hard as our closest allies. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, is that we weren't seeing a whole community that felt isolated or apart from the United States, inside the United States. Our culture was helping us. So what we were seeing instead was that as groups, people were integrating well and weren't disaffected as a whole group, and so it wasn't confined to one geographic region. What we were seeing instead is that we had open investigations in all 50 states of the cases that we brought. We brought them in over 30 jurisdictions, and that there were two trends. One was the age of the defendant. Around 60% were 25 or younger, and 1/3 were 21 or younger. 1/3. That's simply a problem we've never had before. That is not what the profile of an international terrorist looked like. And it speaks to the second trend. The second trend was in almost every case, it was linked to social media. So what they were doing with this new tactic is reaching a cadre, reaching the 21 and youngers who are used to forming friends, trusted relationships online. They were preying on that. And what they were doing is, without ever having to enter into the United States, without ever having to deploy an operative into the United States, they were reaching them from their caves and bunkers overseas, reaching them in real time, forming friendships with this group. And it used to be the assessment of the intelligence community that you'd have to meet someone in the real world to get them to go from idea to violence. And that was the assumption we were on when I was doing this in, say, the early aughts. But clearly that was no longer the case. Now you were seeing people go through that spectrum of radicalization, and it was occurring entirely online. And that's so consistent with other trends that you're seeing with the same 21 or younger. And there are many positive benefits to it, so I'm not saying the technology is bad, but this is what the terrorists were exploiting. So going back to Farizi, which is the example, I think, in the first case where we charged both a criminal offense and material support to terrorism. When you think about the challenge that we are confronting as we transformed to meet the general terrorist threat, which was sharing information across intel, law enforcement, and between sovereign states, our next challenge is tenfold more complicated because it involves the private sector. That's the new element, and that's true in terms of working with the social media companies that are providing the platforms that are being used to do this propaganda and to communicate across country lines, And it's true in terms of who's being victimized and who's storing the information, where 90% of the information is in private sector hands. We cannot confront this threat unless we do a better job of figuring out how to obtain information and obtain it in real time from the private sector. And on the government side, for a long time, much of what we were dealing with in the space was classified because it was obtained through sensitive sources and methods, which meant our bureaucracies were set up in a way that makes it extraordinarily difficult to share information back to the private sector so they can take the necessary steps to protect themselves. That is going to be one of the critical challenges as we go forward. Let me move to the cyber threat writ large. And by cyber threat, so National Security Division, which I headed, we were responsible for protecting against terrorists, spies, and nation states. We've talked a little bit on the terrorist side of the house. We talk about national security cyber threats, and by that I mean those that are posed by nation states, terrorists, those that would commit espionage. I used to be a computer hacking intellectual property prosecutor. So I was a career prosecutor at Department of Justice, ended up specializing in computer hacking and prosecuted criminal on the criminal side of the house. When I was doing these cases in dating up to 2005, 2006, I worked with an amazing squad of FBI agents out of the DC area who did criminal cases. And there was another squad, and that squad was working the intelligence threat. They were behind a locked, secured, compartmented door, and the whole time I was doing the criminal cases, I never went on the other side of that door. Occasionally an agent would switch squads and they just disappeared, never to be seen again. I didn't know what was happening on that other side of the door. And it's not like I was banging to get in, because as those of you who are confronting this issue know, there's plenty to do on the criminal side of the house. When I went over, ended up coordinating that program nationally on computer hacking, and then I went over to the FBI to be counsel to then Director Mueller and later his chief of staff. And he'd brought me over in part because the FBI was seeing, along with the other intelligence community, that the next generation of threats were through cyber-enabled means. So how could we transform institutionally to do a better job of collecting intelligence, and what could we do about these threats? The time I was there, we did an amazing job, and I was able to open that door and see what was on the intelligence side of the house, of starting to work with elements from the Department of Defense, other government agencies, other law enforcement agencies like Secret Service, create a center that was combining all of that information. And one of the things we saw, they had a great tool, much bigger screen than the one behind me, a Jumbotron screen, and they were mapping through this visualization tool in real time what nation-state actors were doing to the United States. Incredible intelligence feed. You'd watch in real time as a hacker overseas would hop into a university, would go from the university into a company, and then we would watch the data exfiltrate out of the United States. So amazing feat. But as you can all imagine, I didn't feel that great watching it happen. So you're watching billions of dollars flow out, and it became incredibly clear when you see that what we're facing is not a traditional intelligence problem. Right, that our approach, which in good faith we've been following on since the Cold War, of keeping this in the intelligence circle, keeping it classified and observing so we could learn about tactics, techniques, and procedures of the adversary, wasn't going to be effective when what you were seeing was costing real companies with real employees real loss now, billions and billions of dollars of intellectual property, trade secrets. Former head of the NSA, General Alexander, called it the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. We're watching this occurring. We got to get in and disrupt it and figure out how to stop the flow from occurring. This isn't traditional intelligence collection. So when I came back to the Department of Justice to head National Security Division and looked, okay, well, how are we applying the same lessons we've learned against the changing terrorist threat when it comes to the cyber threat? The answer was we weren't. So at that point, we still weren't sharing the information, even within the federal government, across the intelligence divide to the federal law enforcement divide to see what we could do to disrupt. So we created a new program at the end of 2012, this is recent, of national security cyber specialists. And they were trained on the one hand on how to handle the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, bits, bytes, all the things that are unique to doing a cyber case. And on the other hand, they were trained on how to protect sensitive sources and methods, given the highest level of clearances, and for the first time read into the full scope of the threat that we were seeing from the intelligence community. This specially trained cadre then, and there's at least one in all 94 U.S. attorneys' offices across the country now, and the larger offices have squads, were sent back out, and the FBI issued an edict to the field that said, thou shalt share what had formerly only been on the intelligence side of the house, just like we do on terrorism cases, with this specially trained cadre. And let's work together. It may not be every case, but let's see, looking across our legal tools, what can we do to increase the cost to the bad guy, to increase the pain to them so that this is no longer a cost-free tool. That is what leads to the first case of its kind in 2014, where we indicted 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398. This was a unit of the second largest military of the world, whose day job was to target private companies inside the United States and steal information from them for the benefit of their economic competitors, for the benefit of other companies. It might be state-owned enterprises, but there are other companies based back in China. This was a definite change in approach. So in order to do this, we needed to do the investigation and attribution in a way that we could make it public, then make it public, and then the third element of this strategy would be impose consequences. And one of the key reasons, I think, that's underestimated in doing this, going back to the challenge that we're facing of how to engage the private sector, is if we don't make this public, how are they going to know the extent of the threat so they can take steps, make the rational investments and risk mitigation strategies to protect themselves? How are they going to drive the demand signal to us in government to say what we should be doing to address the threat? So in this case and in the complaint, which is public, and I should say these are all allegations. I guess I'm not in my spot anymore, but they will, these 5 members of the People's Liberation Army will be entitled to all due process under the law when and if they end up in a courtroom inside the United States to face those charges. But according to the allegations in the complaint, what you saw was things like there's a multinational company based out of the US. They were going to do a joint venture with a Chinese company. Right before they were going to lease a lead pipe to the company, you'd watch these military hackers go into that company and steal the technical design specifications. So instead of having to lease it, they could get it for free. Or, to use another example, we watched them go into a solar company. They stole from the solar company the pricing information that solar company was going to use, and then they price dumped their products into the United States and forced that solar company out of business. And then, to add insult to injury, when that company sued, they stole the litigation strategy. So this gives you a sense of what they're about. And when I say it was their day job, we had an attachment to the complaint that showed this activity spiked around 9 a.m. in the morning, Beijing time. It went from 9 to noon. It decreased around noon to 1. Unlike today, they apparently weren't doing a working lunch. And then it increased again from 1 to 6, decreased at night and on weekends. Thankfully, it was more of a 40-hour-a-day job. But it really was their day job. And so this case caused some controversy. Why would you do it? We've talked about one reason, which is the educative function. But another, those of you thinking about law, I think everyone here is familiar with the idea in our common law or customary law of an easement. So this is the idea essentially that if someone walks across your lawn continually and you don't stop them, they earn the right under the law to walk across your lawn. They get an easement. International law is a law of customary law. So in some ways, think of this case as a giant no trespass sign, get off our lawn. This isn't traditional intelligence, this is theft. It's not acceptable. And as we're trying to make the rules of the road for what former President Obama and others have called what essentially is the Wild West out there in cyber, one of the ways to do that isn't just coming up with them in the abstract, but articulating what they are and starting to take actions so that you make customary law, and that becomes the international legal standard. And it was vitally important because doing nothing was doing something. Doing nothing was saying, it's okay, we're not viewing this as theft, even though it clearly is theft and it's benefiting private economic companies. Is not the traditional national security function that's been recognized in international law for thousands of years. People have also said, well, don't we collect intelligence too? And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But number one, no, intelligence agencies inside the United States are not allowed to target private companies overseas to provide benefit to the competitors here in the United States. Number two, though, from the perspective of the office that prosecutes spies, when we did the Russian illegals case inside the United States, this is the case that the show The Americans was based on, about Russian-trained operatives sent inside the United States to live here undercover. Nobody said, gee, we spy too, let them go. Instead, it's always been assumed if your spies get caught, even though under international law it's legally recognized that you have the right to collect intelligence for national security reasons, everybody knows there's a consequence to getting caught. And I don't see why cyber should be a space that's consequence-free. It would be mistaken thinking. So this is the first time we try this approach of figure out who did it, make it public, and impose consequences. Next big case that comes onto the horizon is the North Korean attack on Sony motion pictures. And I can tell you, including with some in this room, we spent a long time, years and years and years, wargaming. What's it going to look like if a rogue nuclear-armed nation decides to attack the United States through cyber-enabled means? And we never predicted that the first attack would be about a movie about a bunch of pot smokers. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie, but I remember vividly, each morning for me would start with a meeting with the director of the FBI and the Attorney General to go over national security threats. It was over Christmas, and we all suddenly had to frantically watch that movie to figure out what this was about overnight, so it was a little bit of a movie review. It's the only time in my career I've had to go into the Situation Room and try to start a briefing on a national security threat by explaining to the president in a brief synopsis what the plot of that movie is. Which, if you've seen the movie, is not easy to do. So there was a question of, well, why did you take it so seriously? Why were there Situation Room meetings? Why within 28 days after this occurred did you have the President of the United States go out publicly from the podium and say there are going to be consequences? And this is really a little bit about the thinking. Number one, again, we could not have had that response without the cooperation of the private victim. So without Sony, within hours, knowing who to reach out to in government and providing access, we wouldn't have been able to do the investigation and attribution at that speed. Two, from the perspective of the private company, I think they realized going through it, boy, it was nice. In the beginning of it, the entire narrative was blame the victim. What did Sony do wrong that allowed it to be hacked, that turned its computers into bricks, that had its sensitive emails taken and used through information warfare, essentially, against them to embarrass the company? As soon as we as a government could say what we knew, which was that it was North Korea, and make it public, the narrative changed, and people said, what are you going to do about North Korea? What are you going to do to protect our companies and our people from this type of aggression? And that should be on those of us in government, that burden. It was right for that to shift the conversation and not just talk about blaming the victim. Because the fact is, and this was another thing that they asked me to do in this role, I didn't do the talk show circuit very often, but they said go out and could you tell people what's going on? One, that it's North Korea, and two, that this could have happened to over 90% of our Fortune 500 companies would have been vulnerable to a similar attempts to get in. Because the fact remains right now, there's not a wall you can build that's high enough or deep enough. There's not a product out there that can keep an internet-connected system from a dedicated nation-state adversary or even a sophisticated criminal group who's determined to get in. So I went and did the Wolf Blitzer thing, for which I also blame North Korea, in addition to seeing that movie. So getting back to the conversation, so we had a real victim, real harm. There were important reasons to get out there, who did it, so that others would know, be on alert, and inform the public so we could have a rational debate about the severity of this national security threat. But we also looked at it and thought, this may be about a movie, but it's an attack on a core value for our country, and the core value is the right of free expression. If we allow this to go unanswered, we're not just it's not just a bilateral issue. It's not just an issue with North Korea. All of the world is watching. All of the world is trying to figure out what can you get away with in this new space, in cyberspace. They know what red lines are in the physical world, but what are they going to look like when it comes to cybersecurity? And to not take not only action, but public action. So if it's just private action only North Korea knows, that's not going to really help send a message to the other countries figure out what they can do. we had to send a message that there is deterrence, that there are red lines, and that if you do cross them, we are going to take responsive action. Now, as we looked around the table, you have this notoriously difficult country to manage, and we didn't have the same tools available to us, legal tools available to us, that we would if it was, say, a terrorist or someone who proliferated weapons of mass destruction. In some respects, we were lucky it was North Korea because they had done so many other bad things that there was an existing mechanism to sanction them. But we realized then we needed an executive order in place that would allow us to sanction other people, other countries, if what they do is through cyber-enabled means. So fast forward to April of that year, and you have the first executive order of its kind that allows for the sanctioning. And when I say sanction, it means through the Treasury Department, essentially you can name a person or a business and cut them off from any access to the U.S. financial system. It can be extraordinarily impactful to a company or a person who's trying to do business or travel abroad. That executive order, it was signed on April 1st. I know at least one commentator started calling it the April Fool's executive order because you didn't see it used until December 29th of last year. I'll get to that in a sec. In the interim, though, the existence of that executive order plus the indictment of those 5 People's Liberation Army, I think changed the world in some respects. So 2 relatively small actions lead to an unprecedented breakthrough with China. So you have, right before President Xi is supposed to meet with President Obama, the Chinese send over a large delegation into the United States. They outnumbered us with their delegation to try to hammer out so-called 4 points agreement. And key was, for the first time, President Xi said, I agree as a norm, as the rule we should be living by, that one should not use your military and intelligence services to target a private company for the economic gain of another private company, of someone they're trying to do business with. He announced it on stage with President Obama, and several months later, you saw the G20 then, because of that breakthrough, adopt the same norm. So again, as we move from the Wild West to a world of laws, key to that is having people agree on what they should be, and this was a breakthrough. So everyone should agree now that that's against the law. Now, prosecutors and law enforcement would be out of business if having an international norm or a law meant that nobody broke it. So I think the next step is to continue the approach of looking carefully as to whether or not people are living up to their commitment. But you've seen public reporting both from the government perspective and the private companies who are vendors in this area that activity decreased. There was a marked change in activity after that breakthrough that, as far as I know, continues to today. We got a little more mature at applying this approach of figure out who did it, make it public, impose consequences. 1 week in the spring of last year, on a Tuesday, we announced charges against the Syrian Electronic Army for, this was a group that spoofed in a terrorist attack on the White House and successfully convinced people that it occurred and caused the stock market to dip and lose billions and billions of dollars until people realized it was a hoax. And the market went up again. That's that same, so when you think now of a lot of the discussion about fake news and the weaponizing of information and how that can have massive impact because, again, of this new phenomenon of social media and the way people are receiving news and the scope of it, we had incidents like that before, and we're seeing groups other than Russia take advantage of this change, from the terrorist group crowdsourcing terrorism to a group like Syrian Electronic Army using it to cause loss of confidence, to cause stock market value. So that was a case where one of those individuals traveled, got picked up in Germany, arrested, and prosecuted. The other thing that's instructive about the Syrian Electronic Army case, going back to that example of Farizi as well, is what you saw is well called a blended threat. So on the one hand, these hackers were working for the Syrian Electronic Army. On the other, as we laid out, they also were just making money extorting companies who were paying them off through ransomware. By ransomware, I mean tactics like threatening to expose information, but also going in, encrypting your systems so you can't access your own information and saying, pay me a certain amount of dollars or you won't be able to use your computers or data. And we've seen Criminal groups employ that tactic with places like hospitals and patient records where the consequences can be life and death, so there's an enormous incentive to pay off. The public discussion of that is the tip of the iceberg. I've talked to hundreds, and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of companies that are being hit with ransomware, ranging from small to mid-sized to large, and they're just paying it off. And because of that, we're seeing an explosion in the sophistication of these now very well-funded criminal organizations that look as sophisticated as businesses. And when I say that, I mean, if you go onto what's called the dark web, that portion of the web that's not indexed, so it doesn't show up with your Google search, and you know where to look, you'll see a site that looks like Amazon. And when I say it looks like Amazon, I mean it literally has customer reviews and star ratings, but it's for crooks. And it'll say, I've stolen, 100,000 personal names and identities. You'll see the comment bubble that says, I've bought from him before. He's a very reliable crook. And he, unlike some, 14% of these worked, and usually only 7% of the stolen things work when you try to use them later. That's how sophisticated it is. They're also renting out botnets. So we've talked on the national security. I think over the next 5 years, the trend that we're going to see until we figure out a better way to combat it is going to be organized criminal attempts that are on such a scale that it looks like nation-state activity, and they already have those capabilities. The other thing I worry about on this blended threat would be, we know terrorist groups have the intent to cause as much damage as they can. I mean, dating back to 2012, the leader of Al-Qaeda called on jihadists across the world to cause specifically financial damage to the West and attack the critical infrastructure. So the intent is clear. What they haven't acquired yet is the capability of a nation state or even one of these sophisticated criminal groups. And we know that in part because if they had it, they'd use it. So you now have this well-funded, fueled, organized criminal groups building up that capability, and it's only a matter of time before the terrorists figure out how to leverage it, and it might just be by renting it through one of these. So rent the use of a botnet. I'll go into a botnet in a little bit in 1 second. So that's Syrian Electronic Army on a Tuesday. On Wednesday of that same week, we announced charges, or rather, an individual named Subin pled guilty. Subin was a Chinese individual, traveled to Canada, got arrested, served 2 years there while fighting extradition, then came to the United States and pled guilty. And what he had done is, in a co-conspiracy with members of the People's Liberation Army, had hacked into Boeing along with other companies and stole information for a profit. So that was Wednesday of that week. Thursday of that week, we announced charges against Iranian-affiliated actors for their denial of service attacks against pretty much our whole financial sector. So 46 different financial institutions, hundreds of thousands of customers, tens of millions of dollars of loss. And that same group, as we put in the public allegation, had hacked into the Bowman Dam in Rye, New York, accessed the sluice control systems of the dam, and if that dam had been working, would have had the capability to open up the dam. I say if because it was actually down for maintenance at the time. But I think you'll all agree that our crumbling infrastructure shouldn't be our first line of defense against cyber attacks. It's good to be out of government to say these things. But so that was Thursday of the same week. So I think it shows a certain maturity in starting to apply this approach more quickly. That's still very, very new of investigate, make public, take deterrent action. It also shows you that there's a heck of a lot more to do. And that's going to take increased training, resources, and commitment to the policy churn that can occur. Because right now, there's what can seem like a painstakingly long debate. Every time before you take an action back, as people worry about what are the consequences going to be if we take a responsive action to one of these cyber attacks. We're going to have to get faster and have a consistent message to the world. Here's where our red lines are, and we may not tell you exactly what we're going to do in response, but we are going to tell you if you cross one of them that it's going to be proportional and that we're going to continue to take responsive action until we've hit the right level of causing you pain to get you to stop. And that is going to change them, should cause them to change their calculus so it's no longer cost-free. And look, this, again, very new. I think it's around 6 or 7 years ago, as a government official then, I was not allowed to say that China was committing economic espionage inside the United States because it was classified. Everybody knew it in the private sector and they were seeing it. They were not, they were quite noisy at that point. because they knew there was no consequence to getting caught. So, it doesn't take too much attribution skill when you see code in Chinese for the private sector to figure out, I think this was China. And so, but we weren't allowed to say it. So this is still a new approach. And in some ways, we moved very, very quickly on this change of approach over a relatively short period of time. But when you think of what the scale of the threat is, we have not moved fast enough. And I'll stop and then open to questions with the last incident that I know no one is paying any attention to, which would be there were 4 major actors in cyberspace, major adversaries: North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia. So I've talked about 3, and people were asking, well, what are you going to do about the 4th? That's the only one you haven't publicly named. So I think what you saw there, again, if we're consistent with this approach, would be they were trying to undermine a core democratic value. In this case, I'm trying to undermine confidence in the integrity of our electoral system. And so that's at least equal to, if not greater than, a threat to our values than, say, the Sony interference with free expression. And so if we were quicker off the dime on this approach, although you did see this approach applied, then we may have moved faster than October 7th, which is when there was public discussion of what occurred, which took great, investigative and attributive work. And then the consequence part wasn't until December 29th. That was the first time that new executive order on cyber had been used. And actually, to use it required slightly modifying it because it hadn't articulated undermining our confidence in our election as a core value. And so I won't go into the details, but the language didn't quite fit what they had done. So we need generalized language that increases our toolbox so we can move faster off the dime to impose consequences. And there you saw a range of consequences from sanctioning 11 different individuals and entities, to throwing out over 30 intelligence operatives, to closing 2 facilities inside the United States, to making public their use of malware in ways that other countries around the world could take action. But timing matters, and I'll leave it to you, but I think there's a vigorous debate as to, even if those may have been a very strong reaction if they had been taken, say, on October 7th, when they're taken post-election on December 29th, after this campaign has worked, did that send a deterrent message? Is that going to change their behavior when it comes to interfering with French, German, European elections that are upcoming for allies? I'll stop there and open up for questions.
Thank you very much, John. Any questions that we can pose for him? Jim?
Snowden, you have, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, recent call for, a Geneva Convention among, I guess, those large corporate entities like them and Amazon to kind of try to, my sense is, make it more difficult for government to get the information that it needs to do the critical work that you used to do. What do you see as the way forward, or the best path forward, if there is just one or more than one, to try to crack the code and enable the kind of cooperation we need between government and private sector to be able to get the bad guys?
I think first, there tends to be 2 disconnected conversations right now. So you have your privacy conversation and your threat conversation. And to give you concrete, when I first took over National Security Division early on, we went from Boston Marathon case where there was criticism over at the FBI, and I remember getting this. I remember vividly getting this from the same reporter, who, without taking a breath, said, "It's outrageous that you don't have facial recognition technology that would have allowed you to faster identify the Boston Marathon bomber." And then, I guess he did take a breath. Also, it's outrageous what Snowden has just said. If you remember, there within 30 days that you're collecting and anonymizing telephony metadata. And you're like, that seems, one of those seems more intrusive than the other. And I don't know how you can ask me both of those without taking a breath. But that, I think, is true both in terms of sometimes the conversation from private entities who very much are aware of and know and are on the front lines now of national security threats in a way they've never been before. And also for our foreign colleagues, I would get beaten up on the one hand, how can you have these US companies doing business in my country's borders, but my law enforcement can't serve them process without going back to the United States through the multilateral assistance treaty process, which was designed 3,000 years ago and requires doing a 10,000-page document in pen and quill. And on the one hand, and then you'd have their privacy authorities saying, you can't share, a company can't even share information within its own servers from Europe back to the United States. That conflict of law is occurring every day for companies, and I think there is a common interest to large companies trying to do business globally, the countries that share our values who want to protect, want to collect information in a way that's protective of those values, so consistent with their civil liberties, and figure out a way to apply judicial process and other means to serve orders on that company. I tend to think if you try to scope it all at once, that that's going to be difficult to do, so come up with some great agreement that all countries agree with at once. One other approach might be to try to work through bilaterally with certain countries where we closely share values, what a regime might look like so that you could serve process and make that regime, the rules of the road for that regime, transparent. And so I want to encourage you to take a look at, there was a proposed agreement with the United Kingdom that said essentially, if your judicial process is equivalent to ours and vice versa, that we would require congressional change, but that you could serve legal process for a crime that's occurring in your jurisdiction, no matter whether the company is based in the United States or the United Kingdom, and it would not be a violation of law for the company to respond to that lawful process. And many, I think, in the private sector were supportive of that type of approach. And I wonder if we do it that way, try it with one country, everyone can see whether and how it works. If it works well, other countries are going to want in. It's an incentive for everyone to raise the game on what the judicial protections are, because they're going to want into that system for the protective law enforcement, national security sides of their mission. So that's one approach.
One super quick question. Bill?
Back to Russia and attribution and deterrence. The Sony case was striking because of how quickly everybody could come together. The delay in Russia, public reporting suggests that we didn't know was at the highest levels of the Russian government, and the other parts of the IC weren't willing to sign on until they had more about that. Does that seem right to you? And the sanctions themselves are a laugh, I think, in the international community, have no deterrent effect whatsoever. What are the alternatives?
Taking the two first, in terms of the nature of the private discussions within the government, that's one I can't discuss. I'll just say in terms of attribution, according to public reporting, it was quite clear that Russian-affiliated actors were in the DNC servers dating a period back before we made the announcement. So I think there's then the policy question of what type of activity does it take for you to go public or send a deterrent message? And that's an important question. The other just general observation about all of these is going back to whether you view this as a bilateral issue. So if Russia attacks you, it's a Russia issue. If North Korea attacks you, it's a North Korea issue. Or if you start looking at this through a deterrence frame of what we're going to do in cyber if you cross a red line. And I think sometimes we are too wedded to the bilateral approach, and that might make sense in terms of your relations with that particular country. But if you're not taking into account the impact of all of those others watching, it may be worth the churn with that country, or it may not be the most effective tactical response. But strategically, we need to move so people know consistently we're going to act fast, and impose consequences. In terms of what the consequence was, I'll quibble with that a little bit, because it wasn't just sanctions. And in any other time, this played out in a particular way, and there was a timing issue. If you had, in June, just to pick a truly random date, but June of last year, said Russia's hacked into a server and is attempting through information campaigns to assuage an election, We are throwing out over 30 intelligence operatives in an unprecedented step, denying them access to 2 facilities inside the United States. We're doing 11 sanctions and started releasing their code publicly so that countries around the world could see what they were doing on their system. I think people would have, you would have seen a debate that said, did you overreact? And everyone would have viewed that as a very strong series of package. So timing matters. But to your broader point, no, I don't think we have sufficient legal tools in place right now to do deterrence, and it needs to be an area we keep needing to be creative on. So, one tool I didn't mention, with proliferators, we've long used a Department of Commerce tool to designate certain companies, for instance, as ones who you can't do business with because they harm national security without a special license. We used that for the first time in cyber with that individual Sue Bin's company. That might be a tool to further explore what the scope of military responses might be. I don't think we should be wedded to an approach that says you attack us through cyber, so our response is going to be through cyber. That needs to be part of the toolkit. But the fact of the matter is, for us to do an effective deterrent, it might be we are the ones who moved fastest from analog to digital. We have the most systems and vulnerabilities in that space. To use one example, North Korea, according to public reporting, was knocked offline for a couple of weeks. That's like 1,000 internet protocol addresses. We have millions. It would not be good if that was the only battlefield we chose when doing cyber. But we need to look creatively then from everything from Commerce to Treasury to U.S. Trade representative actions to building out our ability to respond through cyber means or others.
Well, John, thank you so much for getting us off to the right start. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be on a shortened break. I just could not cut off that good stuff that John was giving us, but we will reconvene at 9:29 for the next panel.